Leslie Ellis woke up 2 hours before the alarm clock rang. Her heart was pounding under her ribs, like it was trying to break free. Today was her wedding day, the day that was going to be the happiest day of her life, the day she would finally have the normalcy she had so desperately desired for the past 3 years. Outside the window of the Grandview hotel room, dawn was breaking, coloring the Denver sky a soft pink. Leslie carefully slipped out from under the covers, trying not to wake Penelope, who was asleep in the next bed. Her friend had insisted on spending the night before the wedding with the bride, honoring the tradition of the bride and groom's separation. Leslie walked over to the window. Below, the city was waking up, rare cars passing through the still deserted streets, an elderly couple walking a small dog in the park across the street. Ordinary, normal life. Exactly what she was desperately trying to get back. Cool fingers touched her neck. Leslie flinched, but it was only Penelope. "What are you doing up?" her friend asked in a voice hoarse from sleep. "It's only 5 in the morning." "I'm nervous." Leslie tried to smile, but the smile came out tense. "It's not every day I get married." Penelope put her arm around her shoulders, and for a while they looked at the waking city in silence. Leslie could feel the tension ringing between them. Their last conversation 2 weeks ago had ended in an argument. "You have to tell him," Penelope said quietly, as if she had read her mind. "It's not too late, Les." Leslie pulled away abruptly. "We've already discussed this. I won't bring it up on the wedding day. You're going to marry a man who doesn't know what—" "Stop it!" Leslie raised her voice and immediately looked back at the room door. "Enough, Pen. I'm on medication. The viral load is undetectable. I can't infect him. There's no need for him to know." "It's not about infection," Penelope shook her head. "It's about trust. You're building a marriage on a lie." Leslie pressed her lips together tightly. She already regretted telling Penelope the truth. But 3 years ago, when the world had collapsed after a positive HIV test, her friend had been the only person besides her mother who'd been there for her. "I just want to be normal," Leslie said quietly, feeling a lump in her throat. "Don't I deserve to be happy?" Penelope sighed and hugged her tightly. "Of course you do. I'm sorry. Let's not talk about it today." There was a knock on the room door. Leslie flinched as if she had been caught doing something embarrassing. "Are you girls awake?" Natalie Ellis's voice came through the door. "The stylist will be here in an hour, so we need to get ready." Leslie opened the door. Her mother entered the room, laden with packages. At 54, Natalie looked much younger, tall, slender, with a short haircut. She seemed more like Leslie's older sister than her mother. "You look pale." Natalie looked at her daughter critically. "Didn't sleep?" "Worried?" Penelope answered for her friend. "I'm going to shower first, if no one minds." When the bathroom door closed, Natalie looked at her daughter carefully. "Was something wrong?" Leslie shook her head. "Nothing's wrong." Penelope was starting to talk about what I should tell Rick again. Natalie pressed her lips together. Unlike Penelope, she fully supported her daughter's decision to hide her HIV status from her fiancé. "We've discussed this. You're on medication, there's no danger to him. Why ruin your happiness? People are still full of prejudices." Leslie nodded. They had indeed discussed it many times after Spencer had dumped her upon learning of the diagnosis. Leslie had vowed that she would never let anyone else ruin her life over it. Yes, technically she should have told Rick, but she was sure she would then lose him, and she couldn't afford another loss. Thinking about Spencer brought an uneasy feeling to her chest. She immediately suppressed it. Spencer Randolph had disappeared from her life almost 2 years ago. The last she'd heard was that he'd left Colorado. She didn't know if he'd contracted it from her. Didn't want to know. "What were you thinking about?" Natalie asked, laying out her makeup products on the bed. "Remembering how I'd met Rick," Leslie lied. It was actually a good idea to think back to that sunny day last year when her old Ford had stalled in the middle of an intersection. She was sitting there, trying desperately to start the car, when a beat-up pickup truck pulled up next to her. Rick Powell jumped out of the cab, smiling broadly. "Trouble with the little one?" he asked, tapping the hood of her car. "Let's see what's wrong." He fiddled with the car for nearly an hour, then offered to tow it to his shop. By the time the Ford was repaired, they had already arranged a first date. Rick was kind, reliable, and so normal. A normal guy with normal dreams. Expand his little auto shop, buy a house in the suburbs, have a couple kids. He was so different from the ambitious, always on the go Spencer that Leslie didn't even consider him as a potential partner at first. But his quiet confidence and genuine concern gradually melted her heart. 6 months later, Rick proposed to her. She said yes without hesitation, and immediately promised herself that he would never find out about her status. She carefully hid her medications, taking them in the bathroom with the door closed, never leaving her prescriptions in plain sight. Rick wasn't nosy, another quality she valued him for. "Come on, drink your pills and let's go to breakfast." Her mother's voice snapped her out of her memories. Leslie nodded and headed for her purse. She pulled out a small pillbox, then looked around, making sure the bathroom door was still closed. Penelope knew about her diagnosis, but Leslie still preferred to take her medication alone. It was her own personal ritual, a reminder that she had to be in control of her life. With trembling fingers, she pulled out a pill and swallowed it, drinking water from the glass on the nightstand. Then she inhaled deeply, looking at her reflection in the mirror across the hall. Today, she would no longer be just Leslie Ellis, the girl with HIV. She would become Leslie Powell, the beloved wife of successful auto mechanic Rick Powell. There was another knock on the door. This time, it was the hotel receptionist announcing that the stylist and makeup artist had arrived. The day began to pick up steam. The next 3 hours flew by in a flurry of preparations. Leslie almost managed to forget about her worries, immersed in the pleasant process of transforming into a bride. Hair styled into an elegant high hairstyle, makeup emphasizes her best features, big brown eyes and plump lips. But when it came time to put on the dress, anxiety returned. "What if he finds out?" she whispered as her mother fastened the many tiny buttons on the back of her wedding dress. "He won't find out," Natalie replied firmly. "We've been very careful. All your medical records come to my address. You only take your medication when he can't see. None of his friends or family know." "But what if Spencer—" Leslie couldn't finish the sentence. "Spencer left the state a long time ago." Her mother cut her off abruptly. "Forget about him. Today is your day." Leslie nodded. Her mother was right. Today was her day, and she would not let the ghosts of the past ruin it. When the dress was finally put on, Penelope, despite their recent tense conversation, couldn't hold back the tears. "You're so beautiful." She hugged her friend tightly, trying not to wrinkle the dress. "Rick is a lucky man." Leslie felt a prick of guilt. Penelope was right. She had built a marriage on a lie. But the alternative was too frightening. She couldn't risk it. There was a knock on the door, and a photographer, a young guy with multiple cameras hanging around his neck, peered into the room. "Is the bride ready? Time for the first pictures." Leslie took a deep breath and nodded. She was ready. Ready to be Mrs. Powell. Ready to start a new, normal life. As the photographer took the pictures, she tried to smile genuinely, but her thoughts kept returning to Spencer. Where was he now? Did he know about her wedding? Hardly. They had no mutual friends left. After that incident at the restaurant, when she finally confessed her status to him, he had cut all ties not only with her, but with all their common circle. It was painful, but in time she convinced herself that it was even better. "Leslie, look at the camera!" Her mother called out to her, and she snapped out of her thoughts, forcing herself to focus on the present moment. After the photo shoot, it was time to head to church. Leslie walked out of the hotel under the arm of her stepfather, Gerald Clark, who had married her mother 5 years ago. Her birth father had died when she was only 12. A cool spring breeze ruffled the edges of her veil as she got into the flower-decorated car. Her heart pounded with excitement and fear. Part of her desperately wanted to turn back, to tell Rick the truth. But the other part, the stronger part, longed for the normalcy he could give her. "Is everything okay?" Gerald asked, noticing her confusion. Leslie nodded. "Just worried. That's normal for a bride, right?" Gerald smiled and squeezed her hand. "Absolutely normal. Rick's a good guy. He'll take care of you." The car pulled away. Rick was already waiting for her at the church. Cheerful, kind Rick, who had no idea he was marrying a woman with HIV, a woman who had lied to him about the most important aspect of her life. "I love him," Leslie reminded herself. "I'm doing this out of love." But deep down inside, she knew the primary motive wasn't altruism so much as fear. Fear of rejection. Fear of being alone. Fear that her history with Spencer would repeat itself. The drive to the church seemed too short. Soon they stopped in front of the small white building with stained glass windows where her new life would begin today. "We're here," Gerald said as he helped her out of the car. Leslie looked at the church where her husband-to-be was waiting for her and forced herself to smile. Today was her day. The day she was becoming normal. The day the past was left behind. "I'm ready," she said, taking her stepfather under her arm. And they moved towards the church, where the guests were already gathered inside, waiting for the bride to appear. St. Mary's, a small church on the outskirts of Denver, was filled to capacity. Despite the modest guest list of only 50 people, the small room seemed cramped. Leslie stood at the door, holding tightly to her stepfather's hand. Through the thin fabric of her veil, she could see the guests turning their heads to look at her. At the end of the aisle, at the altar, stood Rick, tall and broad-shouldered in a strict black suit, the only time he'd worn a tie since they'd known each other. When the wedding march played, Leslie's heart clenched. The moment she'd been waiting for had finally arrived. Taking a deep breath, she took the first step. The small church was decorated modestly but tastefully. White lilies and roses, satin ribbons on the pews. Penelope had done her best. Despite the strained relationship of the last few weeks, her friend had taken care of most of the organizational chores. Leslie walked slowly down the aisle, feeling every glance burning through her. Everyone seemed to know her secret. Every smile, every whisper between guests caused a wave of panic. But it was only paranoia. No one knew. Other than Penelope and her mother, no one suspected that the bride was hiding a deadly diagnosis. Rick smiled at her, and his smile was so genuine, so trusting, that for a moment Leslie felt a sharp prick of conscience. But she immediately pushed the unwelcome feeling away. She loved him. He loved her. Wasn't that enough? Finally, she reached the altar. Gerald passed her hand to Rick, a traditional gesture symbolizing the transfer of responsibility from one man to another. Rick took her palm in his, and his fingers were warm and dry, while her hand trembled with nervous tension. "You're beautiful," he whispered so softly that only she could hear. The pastor, an older man with kind eyes, began the ceremony. His words of love, fidelity, and honesty sounded like an accusation in Leslie's ears. She vowed to be faithful, to love and honor. But what about honesty? That was a vow she'd broken before she'd even gotten married. "Richard Powell, do you take Leslie Ellis to be your lawfully wedded wife, promising to love and care for her in sickness and in health, in wealth and in poverty, until death do you part?" "Yes," Rick answered firmly, looking her straight in the eye. "Leslie Ellis, do you take Richard Powell to be your lawfully wedded husband, and do you promise to love and care for him in sickness and in health, in wealth and in poverty, until death do you part?" Leslie opened her mouth, but the words stuck in her throat. In sickness and in health. She'd already been sick when she'd met him, and she'd lied about it. "Yes," she finally said, and her voice sounded strange even to herself. Rick didn't seem to notice her hesitation. His face shone with happiness as he slipped the simple gold ring onto her finger. Leslie, however, felt her fingers begin to tremble again as she slipped the ring onto his hand. "By the power vested in me by the state of Colorado, I now pronounce you husband and wife," the pastor said. "You may kiss the bride." Rick pulled back the veil and kissed her tenderly. The church erupted in applause. Penelope, standing nearby as a bridesmaid, wiped away tears. Natalie, sitting in the front row, smiled with pride. Everything was perfect. So why did Leslie feel so heavy in her chest? The ceremony ended and the newlyweds moved back down the aisle, now as husband and wife. Guests tossed rice and flower petals as they left the church. Outside, a photographer was waiting for them for the traditional photo shoot. "Mrs. Powell," Rick whispered, putting his arm around her waist as they posed for pictures. "Sounds good, doesn't it?" Leslie nodded, not trusting her voice. She was Leslie Powell now, a new life, a new her, without the past, without Spencer, without the constant fear of exposure. The photo shoot lasted almost an hour. Shots with parents, with friends, with bridesmaids, romantic portraits of only the bride and groom. All this time, Leslie smiled, but the smile did not reach her eyes. She could not stop thinking about the fact that she had built her happiness on a lie. Finally, it was time to head to the restaurant for the wedding banquet. Golden Harvest, a small but cozy restaurant in suburban Denver, had been chosen for its homey feel and reasonable prices. Rick had insisted that the wedding be modest. They were saving for a down payment on the house in the green suburb he'd always dreamed of. Guests began to gather in the hall, decorated to match the white and blue color scheme of the wedding. The tables, arranged in a P pattern, were covered with snow-white tablecloths and decorated with small vases of blue hydrangeas and white roses. The center table, where the newlyweds, their parents, and witnesses were to sit, stood out with more lush floral arrangements. Leslie and Rick were the last to arrive, a tradition that gives guests time to gather and gives the newlyweds a chance to make a spectacular appearance. When they entered the hall, guests greeted them with applause. The DJ announced their first dance, and Rick led Leslie to the small dance floor in the center of the room. "Are you happy?" he asked as they began to move slowly to the tune of All of Me by John Legend, their song that Rick had once put on during their first trip out of town together. "Yes," Leslie replied, and at that moment, she really thought so. The guilt receded, giving way to hope. Maybe everything would be okay. Maybe he'd never find out. Or if he did, he'd understand why she'd lied. After the first dance, their parents joined them. Gerald danced with Leslie, and Rick's mother, an older woman with kind eyes so similar to her son's, danced with her newfound son-in-law. Then other guests took to the dance floor. Soon the banquet began. Waiters served hors d'oeuvres and champagne while the guests were seated at tables. Leslie and Rick took center stage at the main table with their parents, Penelope, and Rick's best friend Kevin as best man. The menu was simple but elaborate. Fresh vegetable salad, cream of mushroom soup, baked chicken and vegetables, and of course a 3-tiered wedding cake with figures of the bride and groom on top. During dinner, the toasts began. The first to stand up was Kevin, a tall, slightly overweight man who had known Rick since high school. "I remember when Rick called me the day he met Leslie," he began, raising his champagne glass. He said, "Kevin, I think I've met the one." I laughed then. Rick had always been a romantic, seeing the one in every pretty girl who paid attention to him. The guests laughed, and even Leslie couldn't contain her smile. It was true. Rick really was an incorrigible romantic. But this time something was different, Kevin continued. He talked about her incessantly. Leslie this, Leslie that. A month later, I finally met the mysterious Leslie and realized that my friend was gone for good. And you know what? I was happy for him. Because Leslie is really special. He raised his glass higher. To Rick and Leslie. To love that overcomes all obstacles. If you only knew what obstacles, Leslie thought as she raised her glass with all the guests. Penelope stood up next. Leslie tensed. Given their recent conversation, she feared her friend might say something inappropriate. "I've known Leslie for 15 years, Penelope began, her voice trembling slightly. "We met in high school when we were paired up for a biology project. Funny, isn't it?" She threw a quick glance at Leslie and she turned cold. Biology. HIV. Would Penelope really do this? Would she really reveal her secret right now, in front of all the guests? But Penelope continued. "We've been through a lot together in these 15 years. Ups and downs, joys and sorrows. And I always knew that Leslie deserved happiness. Real, pure happiness." She looked at Leslie again, and their eyes met. "I'm so glad she found Rick. A man who loves her for who she is, completely and unconditionally." Leslie felt a lump rise to her throat. There was a hidden meaning in Penelope's words that only the two of them understood. It was not a reproach, but rather a blessing. "To Leslie and Rick," Penelope finished her toast. "May their love be honorable and eternal." The guests rose and the glasses clinked again. Rick put his arm around Leslie's shoulders and kissed her lightly on the temple. Natalie was next. She stood up, elegant in her dark blue dress, and raised her glass. "When my daughter first brought Rick home, I knew right away that he was special," she began. "Not because he's handsome or rich, although he is certainly a very nice young man." The guests laughed and Rick bowed playfully. "And because I saw the way he looked at my daughter. With love, respect, and most importantly, acceptance. He accepts her for who she is, with all her strengths and faults. Leslie tensed. There were those hints again. Had everyone today decided to speak in riddles? Leslie deserves to be loved like that, Natalie continued. And I know that Rick will give it to her. That's why I welcome him into the family. To Rick and Leslie. After the parents' toasts, the main part of the banquet began. The DJ turned on the music, the waiters served food and drinks, the guests went from table to table, chatting and congratulating the newlyweds. Leslie felt like she was in a dream. The events of the day, the ceremony, the vows, the photo shoot, the banquet, all merged into one blurry stream. She smiled, thanked for the congratulations, but her thoughts kept returning to the same question. Had she done the right thing? Did she have the right to tie Rick's life to hers without telling him the whole truth? What are you thinking about, Mrs. Powell? Rick asked, returning to the table with 2 glasses of champagne in his hands. About how happy I am, Leslie lied, taking a glass. Lying was easy for her now, another thing that had changed with HIV in her life. Rick sat down next to her and took her hand. I'm happy too. I can't believe you're my wife now. I am the happiest man in the world. His sincerity made her heart clench with pain. He didn't deserve a lie, but it was too late to change anything. The evening continued after dinner. It was time for another tradition. Cutting the wedding cake, Leslie and Rick held the knife together as they cut the bottom tier of the snow-white cake, decorated with blue sugar flowers. The photographer captured the moment they fed each other the first bites, another tradition symbolizing their willingness to take care of each other. After the cake, the dancing began. The DJ played one rousing song after another, and soon the dance floor was filled with guests. Leslie danced with Rick, then with her stepfather, then with Kevin. She laughed, twirled, but part of her consciousness remained aloof, watching from the sidelines as if the real Leslie was locked somewhere deep inside, and her body was acting on autopilot. At one point, Penelope pulled her aside toward the bar. Are you okay? She asked, looking at her friend carefully. You look strange. Just tired, Leslie replied. Too many experiences for one day. Penelope nodded, but it was obvious that she wasn't quite convinced. Look, I know we don't always agree on some things, but I want you to know that I'll always be on your side, no matter what. Leslie felt tears come to her eyes. She hugged her friend tightly. Thank you, Pen. You have no idea how much this means to me. They returned to the guests, and the celebration continued. Some of Rick's friends started chanting, bitter, and soon the whole room was catching on. Rick, laughing, pulled Leslie to him and kissed her to the cheers of the guests. Toward midnight, coffee and desserts began to be served. The guests, tired from dancing and champagne, gradually calmed down. Some were already starting to go home. Leslie stood by the window, watching the guests and sipping mineral water. Alcohol didn't mix well with her medication, although she allowed herself 1 glass of champagne for the toasts. Rick was surrounded by friends, telling some funny story, judging by the laughter, a very successful one. She watched her newfound husband with fondness. He was so open, so sincere, the complete opposite of her. What did he see in her? Why had he chosen her? Good party, came her mother's voice, approaching almost inaudibly. It's going exactly as we planned. Leslie nodded. Yes, everything's perfect. But Natalie had always been able to read her moods. There's no buts. Leslie took another sip of water. I'm just tired and worried about the future. Natalie put a hand on her shoulder. Stop worrying. You deserve to be happy. Rick loves you, and as for the rest of it, he'll never know. We've been careful enough. Leslie wanted to say that Natalie couldn't be sure, that secrets had a way of coming out at the worst possible moment. But she didn't. She didn't want to spoil the mood of her mother, who had invested so much in this wedding. The waiters began to remove empty plates and glasses. The DJ announced that this was the last song of the evening, a slow song for all the couples in love. Rick walked over to Leslie and extended his hand to her. The last dance, Mrs. Powell? She smiled and put her palm in his. It would be my pleasure, Mr. Powell. They walked out onto the dance floor, joined by several other couples. Rick put his arm around her waist, and they slowly twirled to a familiar tune. At the last chords of the song, he leaned over and kissed her tenderly. "I'm the luckiest man in the world," he whispered. "And I'll do anything to make you happy too. I promise." Leslie smiled, feeling a lump come up in her throat again. His promise was sincere, unlike her own wedding vows. The wedding party was in full swing. The waiters scurried between the tables, bringing drinks, the music filled the space, and the guests, mellowed by the abundant food and alcohol, divided into groups. Some danced, some chatted, exchanging the latest news. Leslie and Rick, already tired of congratulations and toasts, sat at the center table, watching what was happening. "Will we be able to sneak out soon?" Rick whispered, leaning close to his wife's ear. "I'm already imagining how we'll end up in the room." Leslie smiled, giving him a gentle nudge on the shoulder. "Just bear with me a little longer. We need to cut the cake and toss the bouquet. I don't want to break tradition." Rick groaned playfully, but his eyes shone with tenderness. "Whatever you say, Mrs. Powell. You're in charge tonight." Leslie was about to reply when there was a loud slam as the front door of the restaurant slammed violently against the wall. The music continued to play, but several guests standing closer to the entrance turned around at the noise. Standing in the doorway was a tall man. He was dressed in a dark jacket and jeans, his face was tense, and he was clutching a gun in his right hand. Leslie felt the blood rush from her face. Spencer Randolph, the man she hadn't seen in almost 2 years, a man whose existence she had tried to forget. Spencer walked slowly into the hall, and it was only then that people noticed the weapon. One of the women shrieked. The DJ, seeing what was happening, turned off the music. In the silence that followed, Spencer's heavy, ragged breathing could be heard. "Keep having fun," he said, looking around at the crowd with a hard stare. "I don't want to spoil such a lovely party." There was so much bitterness in his voice that Leslie felt it physically. Rick, who didn't realize what was happening, instinctively stood in front of his wife, covering her with himself. "Who are you? What do you want?" Rick's voice was firm, but Leslie could feel his shoulders tense. Spencer grinned, hard without a shadow of mirth. "Oh, you don't know who I am?" He shifted his gaze to Leslie, and the look made her heart grow cold. "Ask your beautiful wife. She knows me perfectly well." Rick turned to Leslie, incomprehension and anxiety mixed on his face. "Les? You know this man?" Leslie opened her mouth but couldn't utter a word. Her throat constricted as if an invisible hand had grabbed her neck. "I'm Spencer Randolph," the man said, taking another step forward. The gun in his hand was pointed at the floor, but everyone present was well aware of how quickly that could change. "Your wife's ex-boyfriend. We were together for 3 years, until the day she finally deigned to tell me she had HIV. There was dead silence in the room. Leslie felt the world around her begin to spin. This couldn't be real. This was a nightmare she was about to wake up from, but it was real. Real were Spencer's eyes, full of pain and rage. Real were the shocked looks the guests were giving her. And real was Rick's face, turning slowly toward her with an expression she couldn't and wouldn't decipher. "What?" he said with a single lip. Leslie felt tears come to her eyes. She opened her mouth wanting to explain, but Spencer didn't give her the chance. "You didn't know?" His voice was full of fake surprise. "She hadn't told you? How sad." History repeating itself. He took another step forward, now standing in the center of the hall. The gun was still pointed at the floor, but his fingers gripped the hilt so tightly that his knuckles turned white. "She didn't tell me either, you know. I found out by accident, found her meds, started asking questions, and then—" His voice trembled, and only then did she confess. Rick was still staring at Leslie, expecting her to say something, to refute the accusations. But Leslie remained silent, tears streaming down her face, smearing her carefully applied makeup. Penelope, standing nearby, stepped forward. "Spencer," she began softly, "let's calm down. Put the gun down. We can talk about this." Spencer turned sharply toward her, and the gun in his hand jerked upward. "Talk?" His voice trailed off into a scream. "I'm dying, Penelope. I'm dying because of her. What is there to talk about?" Spencer's shout seemed to break the stupor that had enveloped Leslie. She stood up, instinctively reaching out to Rick, but he stepped back as if he didn't want her to touch him. "Spencer." Her voice was barely audible. "I'm so sorry. I should have told you sooner. But you know I only found out myself after we were already together, and modern medicine. Shut up! Spencer raised his voice again. Don't you dare talk to me about medication. You've known for almost a year and you haven't said a word. A year, Leslie. You kept sleeping with me knowing you could make me sick. Natalie Ellis, who had been sitting motionless until that moment, rose from her seat. Mr. Randolph, you're exaggerating. My daughter was on medication. Her viral load was undetectable. You couldn't have gotten infected with a protected... But I did! Spencer screamed, his face contorted with rage. I'm bloody infected! I tested positive, and my doctor says that it appears that it was contracted while we were together. Rick seemed to finally realize the magnitude of what was happening. He looked at Leslie with an expression that broke her heart, a mixture of shock, incomprehension, and betrayal. Do you have HIV? He asked quietly. And you didn't tell me? Leslie covered her face with her hands, unable to bear his gaze. Her tears came in rivers, and her shoulders shook with silent sobs. Of course she didn't, Spencer said bitterly. She'd hoped it would never come out, just like she hoped I'd never find out. But secrets always come out, don't they, Leslie? He turned to the guests, still frozen in shock. I just wanted you all to know the truth about your beautiful bride, about what she did to me, and what she may have already done to him. He nodded toward Rick. One of the guests, a large man in a gray suit, stepped forward. Look, buddy, I understand your pain, but you can't just barge in here with a gun and... Spencer raised his gun sharply, pointing it at the man. Don't move! His voice shook with tension. No one dares tell me what I can or can't do. The man froze, raising his hands in a conciliatory gesture. His wife, who was standing next to him, sobbed quietly. At that moment, Rick seemed to shake off his shock. He stepped toward Spencer, still trying to keep himself between him and Leslie. Look, he said, trying to speak calmly. I understand that you're angry, but there are children here, elderly people. Let's go outside and talk like men. Spencer let out a short, barking laugh. Talk? Talk about what? About how your wife ruined my life? Or about how she's probably going to ruin yours too? He shook his head. No, Rick, I don't want to talk. I want her to come clean, right here, right now, in front of all of you. He turned to Leslie, and now the gun was pointed directly at her. Confess, Leslie. Tell them the truth. Tell them you have HIV. Tell them you knew about it when you started dating Rick. Tell them that you deliberately kept it from him like you once kept it from me. Leslie felt her knees shake. She wanted to run away, to disappear, but she realized that was impossible. All eyes were fixed on her. She reluctantly took her hands away from her face and looked up. Spencer was looking at her with such desperation, such pain, that it took her breath away. She'd never seen him like that, not even the day she'd confessed her status to him. He'd been angry then, shocked, disappointed, but not broken, not like he was now. Speak! He shouted, and the gun in his hand trembled. Yes, Leslie finally squeezed out. I have HIV. I found out 3 years ago. The silence in the hall grew deeper, if that was even possible. Rick, who was standing next to her, took a slow step back, as if he couldn't stand to be near her. And you deliberately kept this from Rick? Spencer continued to insist. Hid it from me how? Leslie closed her eyes. She wanted to lie, to say that Rick knew that he accepted her for who she was. But that would only make things worse. Yes, she whispered. I didn't tell him. Rick made a sound that sounded like a suppressed groan. Leslie turned to him, desperate to explain, to make him understand. Rick, please listen to me. I'm on medication. The viral load is undetectable. I couldn't have infected you. You just wanted to be normal. Spencer finished bitterly for her. You always said it. I just want to be normal. As if that justifies lying, like that gives you the right to decide for others. Spencer, I didn't... Leslie started, but he interrupted her by stepping forward. Do you know what happened after I found out? His eyes glistened with unshed tears. I couldn't work. Thoughts of what was happening to me now, what was going to happen next, were eating me up inside. I lost my job. I lost my apartment. I almost lost my mind. All because of you, Leslie, because of your lies. One of the bridesmaids sitting nearby stood up quietly and tried to move stealthily toward the exit. Spencer noticed the movement and turned sharply, pointing his gun at her. "Stay where you are," he shouted. "No one gets out of here until I'm done." The woman froze, fearfully covering her mouth with her hand. Her companion, a young man in a blue suit, stood in front of her, covering her with his. "Calm down, man," he said, trying to sound confident, but his voice shook. "No one here wishes you harm." Spencer grinned. "Evil? No, of course not. You're all her friends. You think she's a victim. Poor Leslie, who had the misfortune of contracting HIV. Poor Leslie, whose ex-boyfriend turned out to be such an asshole that he dumped her when he found out about her status." He shook his head, and Leslie was startled to see his fingers clench tighter on the grip of his gun. "But I'm not an asshole. I just didn't want to live a lie. I didn't want to be with a man who could betray my trust so easily." Penelope tried to intervene again. "Spencer, please." There was genuine concern in her voice. "You're right. Leslie did the wrong thing, with you and with Rick, but that's no reason to get violent. Put the gun down. Let's settle this humanly." Spencer turned to her, and for a moment there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. But then his gaze clouded over again. "Humanly?" He laughed bitterly. "I tried. I asked her for honesty. I begged her to tell me the truth when I suspected something wrong, but she lied, over and over again. And now she's done the same to him." He nodded toward Rick. "She would never change. She would always put her own desires above the safety and well-being of others." Rick, who had been silent all this time, finally raised his voice. "Leslie, is it true?" His voice sounded muffled, as if from a deep well. "Did you know you were HIV positive when we met?" Leslie nodded, unable to say a word. Tears streamed down her cheeks, smearing her makeup. "And you deliberately kept it from me?" Rick continued. "All this time? A year and a half?" Leslie nodded again, feeling the last remnants of her world crumble. "I was going to tell you," she whispered, "but I was afraid you'd leave, like Spencer had left." Rick's eyes filled with pain and disappointment. "You didn't give me a choice, Leslie. You decided for me." Those words, spoken without shouting, without rage, hit Leslie harder than all of Spencer's accusations. Because she knew Rick was right. She'd taken away his choice, his right to decide for himself what risks he was willing to live with. "Rick, please," she reached out to him. "I love you. I never meant to hurt you. I just wanted to be normal." Spencer finished bitterly for her. Always the same excuse. He turned to the guests again, still frozen in shock and fear. "See? Even now she's only thinking about herself, about what she would lose if he left. Not a word about the fact that he might have gotten infected. Not a word of regret that she'd put him at such risk." Leslie felt something break inside her. Spencer was right. She was selfish, putting her own desires above the safety of others. And now she'd lost everything. Rick, her reputation, and possibly her freedom if Rick decided to sue her. The man in the gray suit who had tried to intervene earlier stepped forward again. "Listen, buddy," he began, and Leslie was startled to see Spencer turn sharply toward him, raising his gun. It had all happened too fast. The man took another step, probably trying to grab Spencer's arm. Spencer stepped back and pulled the trigger. The rumble of the gunshot in the confined space was deafening. The man in the gray suit clutched his chest, his face contorted with shock and pain. He took another uncertain step and collapsed to the floor. Screams and cries filled the hall. People tried to take cover under tables. Some rushed for the exit. Spencer didn't seem to have expected this turn of events. He looked at the fallen man with an expression of horror on his face. "I didn't mean to," he began, but his words were drowned out by the screams. One of the waiters, a young man in his 20s, seized the moment and lunged at Spencer from behind. A second shot rang out almost immediately, and the waiter fell, clutching his stomach. Leslie watched the scene as if from the sidelines. It couldn't have been real. This was a nightmare she was about to wake up from. Spencer, realizing the situation was out of control, raised the gun again, now pointing it directly at Leslie. "This is all your fault," he whispered, his voice shaking. "It's all your fault." Leslie watched his finger rest on the trigger. She closed her eyes, preparing for the end. Somewhere on the edge of her consciousness she heard her mother's scream, Penelope's cry, but those sounds seemed so distant, so unreal. The third shot sounded as loud as the first two. Leslie felt a strange jolt in her chest, and then nothing. No pain, no fear, just surprise. She opened her eyes and saw Spencer still standing in front of her, his gun hand down. "I'm sorry," he whispered, and for the first time all night there was no rage in his voice, only an endless, all-consuming weariness. Leslie wanted to answer, but found she couldn't utter a word. A strange numbness spread through her body from her chest. She lowered her gaze and saw a red stain spreading across the white satin of her wedding dress. What a shame, she thought with sudden clarity. Such a beautiful dress. Her knees buckled and she began to fall. Someone's arms picked her up. Rick, she realized, though she couldn't turn her head to see his face. "Leslie!" His voice came to her as if through a column of water. "Hold on! The ambulance is on its way!" Spencer was still standing there, watching her with an expression she couldn't decipher. Then he slowly turned to Rick. "I did you a favor," he said quietly but clearly. "You don't realize it yet, but in time you will." Rick didn't answer. All his attention focused on Leslie, who felt the life slowly leaving her body. Spencer looked around at the chaos he had created. 2 men were lying on the floor bleeding. Guests were panicking and trying to get out of the room. Screams and cries filled the air. He nodded, as if satisfied with what he saw, and headed for the exit. No one tried to stop him. Everyone was too shocked, too scared, or too busy trying to help the wounded. Penelope knelt down next to Leslie, her face contorted with grief. "Hold on, Les," she whispered, squeezing her friend's hand. "Just hold on." But Leslie knew she had nothing to hold on to. Her body was getting heavier and her mind lighter, as if she were separating from her physical shell. Her last look was directed at Rick. She wanted to tell him so much, that she loved him truly, that she never wanted to hurt him, that she would forgive him if he found the strength to forgive her. But only a faint croak escaped her throat. Rick looked at her, and in his eyes she could read such a storm of emotion: shock, hurt, anger, disappointment. But somewhere in there, deep inside, Leslie saw love, too. Maybe not all was lost. Maybe if they'd had a little more time. But there was no time. The world around Leslie began to fade. The sounds grew quieter, and the sensations more and more blurred. The last thing she heard were the sirens of approaching police cars and ambulances. But she knew that for her, help would come too late. In the last seconds of her life, Leslie thought not of herself, not of her shattered dreams, but of those she was leaving behind. Her mother, who would now be alone; Penelope, who would lose her best friend; Rick, whose heart she had broken with her lies; and for Spencer, whose life she'd changed forever with her selfishness. "I'm sorry," was her last thought to all of them before the darkness finally consumed her. Spencer Randolph walked out of the restaurant into the cool spring night. His hand still clutched the gun, but he barely realized it. His mind was empty, all emotion burned out, leaving behind only emptiness. He had done what he came to do. He had uncovered the truth. He had taken revenge on the woman who had ruined his life. So why didn't he feel satisfied? The sirens of police cars could already be heard in the distance. He only had a few minutes to get away. Spencer ran to his car, jumped behind the wheel, and started the engine. The sirens grew louder and louder. He turned on the headlights and drove off sharply. Tonight he would disappear. Out of town, maybe even out of state. But deep down, he knew that fleeing was only delaying the inevitable. Sooner or later they'd find him, and then he'd have to answer for everything.